It had been in a few weeks since John and Kurt had moved into their new house, and Max was beginning to find that he missed the easy evenings in the local bars around the city centre. John had been more reluctant to make the journey into the centre of Brussels. He liked to drink, but he knew that now he would have to drive back to his new house in Tavern. He occasionally would drive in, but it was never the same. He was always watching the time and how much he was drinking. It was not the easy, relaxed evenings that they had become used to. John didn't appear to mind that much, but the late nights were gone. There'd been one night, though, when John broke the rules, staying on until midnight. He was drunk, but was certain that he was good enough to drive the car all the way back to the Tavern. Max didn't think that this was a good idea, but John insisted. He left the bar after midnight and Max made his own way back to his apartment. John had disappeared in the opposite direction. As Max lay on his bed trying to fall asleep, his phone rang. It was John. He was still in the centre of Brussels and he couldn't find the car. It was not as if the car had been stolen, but he simply could not remember where he had parked it. He spent about an hour walking the streets of the city trying to remember. "I'm coming to your place," he said. Max quickly got dressed and made his way down to the front door. John was there, drunk. "I can't find the car," he said. "Where did you leave it?" said Max. "I don't know," he said. "All right," said Max. "I'll help you find it." The two of them set off walking the streets. They went into the municipal parking spaces. No luck. They walked some of the streets. No luck. After about 30 minutes of arguing and questions, John suddenly said, "I know where it is. I parked by the cathedral. That's where it is." Max looked at him. "It has taken you this long to remember," he said accusingly. John just gave a sheepish smile. "I knew it was here somewhere near here. Thanks." With that he walked away and left Max standing in the street. Shaking his head in disbelief, he made his way back to his own apartment. It was now the middle of summer and the air was warm. All the week the temperature had been high and had been promising to stay that way throughout the weekend. With his promise of good weather, John had planned to make a barbecue at his house. He'd invited a few of his closest friends, including Max, and he was eager to make it a day to remember. This was the first time he had invited people to the house, and he was excited to show them what he and Kurt had done with it. Max didn't have a car, so the only way he could make it first was to take the metro from the centre of Brussels to a midway station called Montgomery. From there it was a short walk to the tram station attached to the metro station. The number 44 tram would take him from Montgomery all the way to Tavern. The journey would take about 30 minutes and took him through the suburbs of Brussels, finally to the terminal tram station in Tavern, close to the Africa Museum. It was an easy journey and he enjoyed travelling by tram. It was something that he had never done when he was living in Britain, and it was another new experience for him. Life these days was filled with new experiences. As he sat in the tram making its way out of Brussels, Max was looking forward to seeing the house now that it had been completed. The last time he had seen it was on the day they had helped them move in. Since then, they had fully unpacked, and from what John had said on the phone, he was very happy with it. In fact, he was happier than he had ever been. It was the first time he had felt at home. Having his own house, although it was rented, he really felt at home here. Tosca always loved it. She liked the idea of having a garden to run around in. She had grown up in an apartment, and the green grass of a lawn was also a new experience for her. According to John, she loved it. Max arrived at the tram station in good time and walked into the main road. There were a few other people who had travelled with him on the tram, and each one made their own way, separating in different directions. He pulled his phone out of his jacket pocket and phoned John. He had been advised to call him as soon as he arrived at the tram station, and then John would come to the station by car. It was some way from the tram, And although could have walked there, it would have taken quite some time. It was a long walk. To make life easier, John had come and offered to pick him up and give him a lift around the house. John answered the phone quickly and Max explained that he had arrived. John agreed to come and pick him up. Max ended the call and started to wait. It was an attractive place to wait. It wasn't the normal city tram station. It was in the country next to a long road that stretched into the distance. There were trees all around the area and the sun was shining. Max felt good and relaxed. He was looking forward to seeing John and Kurt and to see the house again. A few minutes later, a BMW Mini pulled up in front of him and John waved to him through the front window. Max walked over to the car and got into the passenger seat. "Hello, darlings," said John with a large smile. "How are you? Good?" Max nodded. "Yes, I'm good." John put the car into gear and drove it around so that they were facing in the opposite direction, and then with his foot on the accelerator, sped off down the road. As the car made its way along the road, they chatted as if they were friends who hadn't seen each other for a long time. John's excitement was obvious and he couldn't stop talking. Max simply sat back and listened to him. After a while, they turned into a side road which led along the country road which led to the house. This was Moselstraat, and for some reason it had become the name of the house. In the future, when they were talking about the house, it was always called Moselstraat. The name of the road had become the name of the house. Finally, they reached the house and John turned into the driveway and stopped quickly. "Here we are," he said, looking at it. "What do you think?" "It looks good," replied Max, not sure what to say. The house looked the same as it had when they had moved in. "Wait until you see inside," replied John. He quickly undid his seatbelt and left the car. Max did the same and followed him. At the front door, John put his key in the lock and opened the door. Tosca came running out of the kitchen and up to him. "Hi, darling," said John as they walked through the door into the kitchen. Tosca turned her attention and moved over to Max. Instinctively, he picked her up and held her in his arms. She started rapidly licking his face. "Tosk, stop," he said, laughing. She was making his face wet, so he put her gently down on the floor and let her run back into the kitchen. Max followed them through into the other room. The house looked completely different. The furniture fitted easily into this place. They had done a good job. Max threw his jacket onto a chair and entered the kitchen. Kurt was busy at the sink and was preparing some salad. "Hi, Kurt," he said easily. "Hey, Max," said Kurt, hardly looking up from his preparations. "Go through to the patio. I'm getting everything ready." John had gone directly to the fridge and opened it. Max could see that inside there were 2 shelves filled with cans of beer. He grabbed 2 cans and handed one to Max. "Do you want one, Kurt?" he asked. "Put one on the side," replied Kurt and continued with his jobs. John placed the can of beer next to him and then quickly kissed him on the back of the neck. "Stop it, John," replied Kurt, suddenly slightly annoyed. John laughed. "You like it," he said, laughing. And then taking his can of beer, moved past him and out of the kitchen door. Max took his beer and followed him out onto the patio. Max and John stepped out of the kitchen door and onto a small patio at the back of the house. There was a large garden table set up by the lounge window that opened onto the back garden. John had erected a large green umbrella next to the table, which provided them with some shade from the bright sunshine. The garden itself was large and untouched. To Max, it looked like a small field rather than a suburban garden. There were no flowers and features, other than the 1 or 2 wildflowers that were growing down at the right-hand edge of the garden. At the far end of the garden, there were about 3 or 4 tall trees which settled that end of the garden and made a kind of garden fence again. On the left side was a large, well-kept hedge that was enormous. He had seen hedges in houses before, but this was a magnificent specimen. From where they stood, he estimated it was at least 10 feet tall. Certainly taller than him. It had been well kept and trimmed over the years. It had for a few seconds he admired, and it was a wonder. How much work would it take to keep such a hedge in good shape, he thought. It would be a major task every year. The two of them sat down on the garden table and started chatting as they drank their beers. Kurt was still in the kitchen, quite happily preparing the offering of salad and barbecue meats. The barbecue itself was standing by a tree close to the patio, and it had recently been lit. There was smoke rising from it. For a few seconds, a gentle breeze caught the smoke and wafted it towards them. "Don't worry," said John. "It'll calm down soon. It usually takes about an hour for it to reach the right temperature. Then we can start cooking." The two of them sat back and continued drinking their beers. "Are you okay in there?" called John, turning towards the kitchen door. "Kurt, are you okay? Do you need any help?" A voice from the kitchen called back, "No, I'm fine." "It's nearly ready," Kurt called back. "He's such a good cook," replied John, turning back to Max. "He really is. I'm so lucky to have him." "Yes, you're lucky," said Max. Max was realizing how right John was. He was lucky. He had someone he loved and cared for. He had a new house that he had made his own. He even had a dog. To Max it was though John had everything. For a moment he felt jealous. It was not that he didn't have something, a home, but for now he thought that seemed far away and belonged to another life. He could always go back there. He could go back to Jane, and perhaps the two of them could have this. Back in their suburban house in Birmingham with its neat gardens and its neighbours that locked themselves behind closed doors. Neighbours who only came out to wash their cars on a Sunday morning. People who had tight, neat, ordered lives. Max was beginning to realize that he was no longer a life that he wanted. He wanted the freedom that this life here in Brussels allowed him. A life where he could be free and the person that he wanted to be himself. Jane would never accept this life. She was one of those people who liked her life ordered and familiar. They had even chosen the house because her parents lived in the next street and she could visit them whenever she wanted. Here she would be totally lost. She didn't have the experience or willingness to expect or accept or want new experiences, to meet new people, to discover the world outside of the claustrophobic life that they both lived over the years. Here nothing was familiar. Everything was new, and for Max he found friends. He could guide him and teach him how to make the best of living in another country, living in Brussels, to find out all about what it had to offer. Yes, John was lucky. He had found a place in his life. Max realized he was still searching. Max and John had been sitting outside in the sunshine for a few minutes when there was a sound of the doorbell. "John," called Kurt from the kitchen. "The door. Can you get it? It'll be Karen." John quickly stood up and made his way through the kitchen to the front door. Max stayed where he was, sitting at the table. From his position he could hear the door open and the sound of voices. One was a woman, and he assumed that this was their other guest. He heard the door shut and voices getting louder. "Hello, Kurt, my darling," said a woman's voice in the kitchen. "Hey, Karen," replied Kurt. Max strained towards the kitchen door. He was thinking of going in, but decided to wait for the others to come out and join him. In the kitchen, he could hear the sound of three of them chatting away. After a few minutes, John came back out into the patio and followed by Karen. They were introduced, and Karen took a seat next to him. "Do you want anything to drink, Karen?" John asked, still standing in the kitchen doorway. "Wine, please, darling," she said, smiling at him. Karen Muller was a pleasant-looking woman in her 50s. She had bright blonde hair, which she wore at shoulder length, and bright, smiling blue eyes. She was dressed in a large pink dress and had a full figure. She was German, but spoke perfectly English with a European accent. In fact, Max learned later that Karen was fluent in German, English, Dutch, and Spanish, having lived in various different parts of Europe most of her life. As she started to talk to Max, he found her pleasant company. She was bright and intelligent. She asked the usual questions. Where he came from, where was he, who was he? All the questions he was becoming used to when first meeting someone for the first time. Karen was open about herself. She had 3 grown-up children and a grandchild. Her children all lived in Tverin, and she had been married for many years but had divorced her husband when she discovered that he was having an affair with a younger woman. She was direct about it, and during that part of the conversation kept referring to her husband as that bastard. Max and her found that they got on very easily. Gone was the usual awkwardness of a first meeting. Karen was open, warm, and happy to chat away about her life, occasionally asking something about Max. He responded quickly and easily, and they began to laugh together. Max brought a glass of wine out for Karen and another beer out for himself. He came and sat down at the table, and the 3 of them started chatting as if they were old friends and had known each other for years. John was his usual effervescent self. Max was beginning to realize that he loved people and there was no hesitation about him. "Where is Kurt?" asked Karen, looking towards the kitchen door. "It's all right," came Kurt's reply. "I'm nearly finished." "Come out here, darling, and join us," replied Karen, laughing. "In a minute," he replied. "You work him too hard, John. It's not fair," she said, turning back to the table. "He enjoys it," replied John. He'll be out soon, and then we can start cooking." Karen took a drink from her glass of wine. "I brought some things with me. Some special treats from my last visit home to Germany. You can have those later," she announced. Finally, after a few minutes, Kern came out of the kitchen carrying a can of beer. Pulling out a chair, he joined them around the table. "Is the barbecue ready?" he asked, looking over towards the barbecue standing next to the patio. "It's still smoking," replied John, looking at the same direction. "I guess it's hot enough to start cooking." "Okay," replied Kurt. "Let's do it." Kurt brought out the food that he had spent the morning preparing. There were plates of meat and then more plates of salad and a variety of other dishes he had prepared. The meat was unwrapped and placed carefully on the barbecue grill. There were burgers and sausages. There were different meats on skewers mixed with peppers and onions. As Max looked on, he couldn't believe the amount of food that had been brought. There were only 4 of them after all. There were also large potatoes wrapped in foil that were also added to the barbecue to cook through. As the hot ashes began to smoke again from the meat fat, it filled the patio area and they began to cough. The gentle wind soon moved it away, and the 4 of them were able to carry on with their conversations. Karen had brought a few bottles of German wine, and there was plenty of beer in the fridge. In the warm afternoon sunshine, they chatted amongst themselves and joked. Max felt at home, and not a stranger. They all were there together as friends, as old friends who simply enjoyed each other's company. Tosca had finally come out of her bed and was wandering around the garden, sniffing the grass as she went. For time to time, Kurt would get up from his seat and walk over to the barbecue. Using a long fork, he carefully turned each piece of meat so that it would cook evenly. As the smaller pieces cooked thoroughly, he would take the fork and pick them off the heat and place them on the plate. Karen had already started on the salad and was filling a plate with a variety of food from the different dishes. John appeared happy to drink his beer, and from time to time he would disappear back into the kitchen to get another beer from the fridge. Max was happy simply to sit there as he was and be served upon. Each time he finished a beer, another one would appear in John's hand. Karen was happy to stay with the wine. One bottle after another came out, opened and poured into a glass. For Max, this was a day he would look back on as a perfect day. The air was warm and the sun continued to shine through the afternoon. There was more food that he could easily eat. The beer was also having an effect on him. He still wasn't used to Belgian beers, and the more he drank, the more he could feel he was relaxing and talking far more than he wanted to, far more than he was used to. He couldn't remember such a time back home in Britain. He had been to barbecues before, but they were usually a boring affair where people walked around with a drink in their hand and trying to balance a plate of food. They'd been enjoyable at the time, but he didn't really know anything else. Now he was in a different world, and he didn't, for 1 second, miss his old life. Perhaps if some of his friends had been here, it would have been better. Perhaps if Jane had been here, it would have been different. But they weren't. He was here on his own, with people he hardly knew, and he was thoroughly enjoying himself. John was perfect host, Karen was fun to be with, and Kurt was warm and welcoming. This was the life he wanted, the life he'd been looking for. Throughout the afternoon they ate and drank. They laughed and chatted. Tosca had finally come up the table and was fed small pieces of meat from the table. As he sat and ate, the sun gradually went down as the afternoon advanced. Finally they'd finished. There was food left on the table, and John announced that it didn't matter because it would be wrapped up and put in the fridge for later. There was enough left over for 2 or 3 more meals. The table was cleared, the dishes washed, and the 4 of them settled back on the patio to enjoy the warm evening. Karen had come to the last bottle of German wine and announced that she had finished this and she would have to make her way home. She had driven here in a car, and although she was possibly well over the limit, it wasn't far to her apartment to Vernon. She was sure she was okay to drive. John looked over at Max. "Do you want to go?" asked John. "No, not really," replied Max. He was enjoying himself too much and wasn't looking forward to the trip back to his own apartment in the centre of Brussels. "That's all right," said John. "We've got a spare bed. You can stay here." To Max, this was a great offer. This meant that he could stay as long as he wanted, and when they had all decided it was late, he only had to walk into the house and put his head down on the spare bed, and the drink was beginning to get to him, and his words were slurring, and he didn't really want to have to go back to the tram. And "Thanks," he said. "That's great." Oh, what a great idea, he thought. I don't have to go home. I can just stay here, crash out on the bed. "Decided," said John. "Another beer?" he asked. "Yes, please," he said. And John disappeared once again into the kitchen to get another can of beer from the fridge. Karen smiled. "You're enjoying yourself, aren't you?" she said. Max smiled over at her. "Yes," he answered. Very much."